Okay, I wanted to talk about Goth elitism, and this is not meant to be a very long video. I was on the fence about making an actual video versus making this more like a Goth talk podcast type of thing. And I'm just going to do it this way because I feel comfortable to do it this way, and sometimes I'm just not going to show my video. So if you like to hear a lot of my stuff, and I'm just pretty much going to be doing the same thing as I would in a normal video, if you would like to just hear what I have to say about Goth elitism, then stick around. So my thoughts about Goth elitism. This isn't something that I haven't talked about before. I've mentioned it many times over the years about Goth elitism, but there are some other points about it that I wanted to talk about because over time I learn more things and I discover more things, and sometimes there are things that I want to add to it. So for those of you who do not know what elitism is, a lot of you do know what it is, but just to clarify, elitism is the advocacy or existence of an elite as a dominating element in a system or society. And that is the exact definition of elitism. And when it applies to the Goth scene, it's mainly what you would see. Most people say elder Goths are just like this, but honestly, there are Goths who aren't elder Goths who do this stuff. And there are quite a few elder Goths who aren't elitists as well. As you know, Goth has started quite a while ago. I did a history on Goth recently, though that mostly talked about the word Goth in general. It did briefly mention how Goth basically started like 70s, 80s, I would say late 70s, if my memory serves me correctly. So the music and aesthetic started around that time, and that's pretty much the pinnacle of the modern Goth for today, even now. And I agree with that, and I agree with the history of it. But the elitism is basically, if you're not basically trad Goth is pretty much the pinnacle of everything, because trad Goth is traditional Goth. You can't see me do quotations, but original quotations. Goth. You don't listen to the music. They don't consider you, the elitists don't consider you Goth. First of all, most Goths will tell you if you don't listen to Goth music, you are not considered Goth. The aesthetic is important as well, but a lot of them are kind of weird about that. Like it's really important, but like they're harder on you if you don't know the history of Goth, basically, in the scene. And I'm going to talk a bit about my experience with this. This is my opinion and my experience based on who I've talked to and what I've seen. So not everyone's going to have the same experience as me, obviously, or even the same opinion, or might have more of an opinion on this. And I'm not one to go to talk about hours of why I think Goth is this or that, because it's just not going to be me. So back around the trad Goth time, it was almost unheard of to, or probably mostly unseen, to see a Goth that was black or any other race, really. A lot of the older videos and pictures, you see mostly very pale people who are Goth. And I'm not saying that the Goths of color did not exist, because I'm pretty sure they did. You just didn't really see them. And it was probably a fear of being that way too, because of the stereotypes and everything like that. So I'm talking a bit about my history about this, because a lot of people ask me, how did you get comfortable being Goth, and how did you start? I get quite a bit of people doing this, and a lot of baby bats asking me this for sure. Ask me this, and I'm just like, I just was. You know, there's really no answer of how you like get into it. Like, of course, like, you know, do your research. I don't think that's a part of elitism. I think doing your research is actually probably a good thing, because before you get into something. know a bit about the history. And me, however, my introduction to goth wasn't, I don't know if there's a normal introduction to goth, because a lot of people get into goth for different reasons. Some people saw their friends do it, or they saw someone else do it, they influenced them. Some people got inspired by the music culture. There's a lot of ways. And my introduction to goth was just, well, I don't really know how to say this except existing. I just was into a lot of what people thought was a goth thing now. It's considered goth now. I was into the Crafts, the Addams Family. I just love watching it. Like, I watched it like so many times. I listened to The Cure when it played on the radio. I didn't know it was goth music. I just listened to it. Evanescence is not goth. It has goth aesthetic in it, and it's not goth. And Amy Lee never claimed to be goth, to my understanding. So I knew that wasn't goth, but she still had the aesthetic, the music, the vibe to it. There were a lot of things that I was into that lean more into the darker aesthetic. I didn't necessarily always dress that way. I had a period where I didn't dress that way, and now I dress the way I do because I'm able to do it. I wasn't always able to do it. Not everyone who gets into the goth scene is able to do that for various reasons. They're not always able to dress the way they want to, or some people dress very simple, some people dress very extravagant. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it. Now there's a lot of branches of goth now. And the elitism, though, okay, let me talk about this, because it goes deeper than just like you don't listen to the goth music. The elitism is mostly like you don't listen to the music, you're not goth, blah, blah, blah. But it's also, if you don't act a certain way or stick to a certain thing, you aren't goth. Like, I don't like how goth has become a box. And if you step outside of that box even a little bit, then people don't consider you goth anymore. And there are some people who don't label themselves as goth, they have darker aesthetic, and they don't consider themselves goth too. So where do you become goth in that? Like, well, for one, that's how you identify. If you don't identify as goth, then you're not goth. It doesn't matter if you listen to the music or not, because there's people who listen to gothic music or dress in all black, but do not identify as goth. They might have a goth-like soul, but they don't identify as goth. So I've identified as goth most of my life. It has not gone away. It's not a phase for me, obviously, at this point. I'm always going to be drawn towards the darkly inclined stuff as well. However, that box that people put you in, if you're not in it, I feel like they say you're not goth or whatever. And I feel like that's where the elitism starts. The moment you stick your foot outside of that box, that black box, people come for you, basically. So let's say if you're goth, just average goth, you enjoy the gothic music, gothic rock, and whatever, you dress, you know, how a typical goth would. You wear your makeup and your hair like a typical goth. And say you like decide to listen to something non-goth. Say you like country or something. I don't personally like country, but I'm just giving an example. And you decide to wear pink one day because you like pink. And then you post a picture or you talk about it, and like the goth community be like, oh, what the hell? You know, how are you goth if you listen to that or you do that? Well, you're not goth, you're a poser, you know, that kind of shit. So if you like something and you like it a lot outside of the goth scene, you're automatically a poser. That's when I have a problem with the elitism. Now, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, you know, check out the history of goth, you know, this is how it originated, because it's good to know your history, you know. A lot of that happened before a lot of our time. We weren't aware of that. It happened before my time when goth first started. So I did find out the history of it. And at some point, I think like maybe direct or guide people to that. Sometimes people find that stuff out on their own, but like direct or guide them to it instead of trying to pressure them to do that kind of stuff. All right, my opinion about this is probably gonna go over a lot of people's heads here, but I'm gonna say this. I'm gonna say this right now, and a lot of people are going to disagree with that. You don't have to like goth music to be goth. There, I said it. I personally, I do, but I don't feel like you have to like goth music to be goth. I don't feel like you have to even dress a certain way to be considered goth either. So, and then people are like, okay, so then what makes you goth then? You know, if it's not the music or the aesthetic, what makes you goth? I think goth is a way of being. Like I was mentioning earlier, how I basically had a goth soul like all my life, even before I knew what the fuck it was. And my only introduction into goth was like what I saw on TV or movies at that time. And I just assumed like this is beautiful, but I can't do this because I'm not pale or like this or that. And I'm going to go into that as well because that falls under the elitism and how the elitism has changed over the past few years. And yeah, so I think it's the soul. I think it's how you are. With the things you like, the things you're naturally drawn to. And there's so many rules, like goths can't be happy. That's changed over the years. Like people aren't as weird about that now, but like give it a few years ago, if you're all smiling and happy and like being out in the sun, they're like, why are you out in the sun enjoying the sun? Goths aren't supposed to like the sun. But there are some who do enjoy the daytime. I mean, most of us like the night, but not all of us like the same things. It's so important to realize that we're not all the same. We dress similar, but our personalities aren't the same. Some of us have really shit personalities and some of us have really wonderful personalities, just like anybody else. You know, being the way we are doesn't automatically mean we're a certain way, the stereotypes or whatever. A lot of people didn't really recognize or embrace their goth side till they heard something or saw something that was not necessarily goth, but was goth inclined, like Manson. I know Manson's not goth music, so don't come for me with that. But his aesthetic, especially back in the past, was considered, well, gothic at the time. And no, I don't support him now, but way back when, before everything happened, I didn't know too much about him. I did listen to him sometimes. I did enjoy that. I listened to metal as well. I still listen to metal. And that kind of pushed me more towards that aesthetic. And I never consider myself a metalhead because I don't just like mostly metal. This same type of discussion can be said about metalheads as well, but I'm not a metalhead, so I can't speak for them. But I've known quite a few of them. So yeah, so you can not look like a goth person or necessarily like all goth music or any and still be considered a gothic soul. Personally, I believe that. I've been around people, I don't hang around just goth people. Most of the people in my life that I've hung around have not been goth, actually. And a lot of them had the gothic soul. And I would tell them that, like, you know what? You have a gothic soul. You're into a lot of gothically inclined things. And I wanted to mention this because I noticed that this is still happening. There's basically 3 levels of goth right now. And no, this is not official. This is unofficial. This is just my description. There's the elder goths. There's the baby bats who just got into it. And the elder goths are obviously the people who've been around for a while, who basically was there when goth started. And you got the people in between. And I'm one of the in-between people. And I am, and the rest of my generation is the next level of elder goth. We're going to be that eventually. And I keep thinking, like, with all these rules and this elitism, it makes it difficult for other people to be introduced or to want to be into the subculture and feel comfortable to do it, because a lot of people who have messaged me are so nervous about messing up, and I'm just like, be yourself. And the rules and how strict and how mean some people in the goth community can be is just making them feel like they have to be a certain way besides themselves. Like, don't strip your identity for some cliquey subculture. I said it. A lot of the goth subculture is pretty cliquey. Not all of them, but it's gotten to that way. And that is the opposite of what we stand for. We stand for uniqueness, and we just like darker things and the dark aesthetic. We just like those things. But we're not supposed to be cliquey. We're supposed to be a little bit more open. And I know a lot of us are, I'm myself included, a lot of us are like antisocial or introverts. Not all of us. We mostly keep to ourselves. But like when someone's trying to fit in and they feel called to be a part of the community, we shouldn't be shunning them and making them feel like they're inferior because they don't know everything. And you're not going to know everything when you first go into it. Oh, because they haven't been listening to this gothic band for X amount of years or whatever, or they didn't do the research immediately, probably because they don't know what to look at. When I got into the community, I didn't know any of this stuff. I was just already doing some of the things already before I officially entered the community, because I do feel like I have been a part of it for quite a bit of my life. And I was already doing some of those things, so I just kind of naturally slowly went into it. But the whole aesthetic thing, I didn't get a hang of until a little bit later. It took a while. And back when I started Black Silk, I had a lot of people excited to see more goths of color in the scene. And on the internet, because mostly what I was seeing was like people like Razor Candy. I don't know if she still considers herself goth. She's still alternative. Adora Bat Brat, people like that. That's the people I saw. I didn't see anyone like me back then. And then when I was one of the people who went out there on Facebook, people were happy about it. And then more people started doing it. And it's just become a big thing now. Like not everybody's doing it, but a lot of people are doing it regardless of their background. And everyone's introduced to it a different way. And most of the time, most people are doing it because of the internet. Some people are just genuinely interested. Now, with the elitism, I can understand where some of them are coming from, the elitist. I don't agree with their method or how they're talking about it, but I can understand because they feel like their identity as a goth is being threatened when someone comes into the subculture and just decides they want to be goth randomly one day, and they don't do any research or anything like that. And unfortunately, hate to burst their bubble, but sometimes you got to experiment with different things to know if you're into it. There, I said it. You don't just go into things and just stick with that the rest of your life. Some people go through phases. Not everyone stays the same. Not everyone stays goth most of their lives. So some people, like the baby bats, they don't stay that way. Sometimes they decide to do something else. And I feel like people are being a bit harsh when they do that. Like, I see memes like this too, where, oh, the preppy girl who bullied the goth back in school, now all of a sudden she wants to be goth. Honestly, I can see how that's fucking annoying. I really can. But I'm thinking someone who does something like that was basically jealous of the goth girl, and she was too afraid to let her true self out, and she finally got to do it later. That shit happens sometimes. And I'm not defending bullying, because bullying freaking sucks. But I'm just looking at it from a different perspective. Like, she was definitely jealous, and she wanted to be like her, and she didn't know how to be. Or she had a crush on her. Or it's not just women. It can go either way, any gender. But yeah, some people bully people they want to be like. They're jealous of how free you are or how you're able to be yourself. And I'm no exception to that, especially when you first get into the goth scene and you're dressing like it. It's not easy. It's not easy doing that. I remember what that's like, because it's a whole new feeling to have people look at you differently and treat you differently because of the way you look and dress. And a lot of the goth people know that. So I think it's up to the elder goths and the middle goths, who aren't elder yet, but they're not baby bats. I think it's up to us to really set an example and to be kind to the ones entering the scene, as long as they're not being rude, and just really help them understand and guide them into it. And if they don't want to stay that way, then that's their choice. But I feel like a lot of it's gone about the wrong way. With elitism, like, I want to talk about there's other types of subcultures. I could just think of some of them. I don't know all of them because things change and I don't keep up with all that. But I know, like, the sad boy, sad girl, e-boy, e-girl aesthetic. A lot of people confuse that with goth. Emo has been another one that's been confused with goth for a long time. That used to irritate the hell out of a lot of us. I've been called emo. I've been called grunge at one point too. That was once, and it was a long time ago. And oh, Juggalo. I don't know if those are still around, but yeah, that's another one I got confused with the goth thing. And I know, like, a lot of them get confused. It's other stuff, even metalheads too, honestly. Like, some metalheads have been called goth too, and they're like, no, I'm a metalhead, I'm not a goth. But yeah, there's other stuff out there that gets confused with goth, and we try to, like, separate each other, segregate, not necessarily segregate, because a lot of us mix together, but, like, when people call us something we don't identify as, a lot of us get pretty pissed off. But, like, that used to bother me a lot, and it doesn't really anymore, because my identity, I'm not attached to goth. I just like goth stuff, and I lean more towards the gothic stuff. So that's what I'm okay with being identified as. But if I was called something else, it doesn't really matter. I'm not attached to that identity. I'm not offended if someone steps into the subculture and they're trying it out and they don't understand what's going on. Now, I can't say that in the beginning. When I started, I wasn't, like, outright cruel to people, but I was a little cliquey. But it was mainly because of the people I was around, and I was just starting out, and I thought that was normal. We're supposed to be like that, like, ew, normies, blah, blah. But, like, that's why a lot of them are afraid to approach us and don't understand us if we're like that, honestly. The best way to get them to understand us is for us to talk about it. And there are goths out there on YouTube who do talk about this, but some of them I still feel like are very cliquey minded and very elitist minded. Not cliquey minded, but click, like, they're cliques, and they're very elitist minded, and people get the wrong impression. And unfortunately, I don't feel like a lot of people really get every perspective they should get in the goth, the subculture, with especially with YouTube. What's most popular on YouTube is, unfortunately, the common stereotypical goth: skinny, white, pale. There are some goths of color who actually have a good following, which is really good. I'm not one of them, but I have my reasons, I guess. I'm just going to be me regardless. So let me go ahead and talk about the other forms of elitism that's still actually going on now. There's still elitism. It's not as bad as it used to be, because we were pretty much, I guess, according to most people, non-existent. It's not as bad with the elitism with people of color. And if you try to come for a person of color and say they can't be goth, especially online, the goth community will come for you really quickly. So I love that about the goth community. The goth community will do that. But But there's still elitism when it comes to that in a community. Just not everybody's voicing it because they know they're going to get attacked for it. But it's still there, and you can still, some of us can still feel it when we're out and about and in Gothic events. Some people are still like that, but it's not like extremely bad. But another part of this that really bugs me is that it's not talked about. Not just race in the community, but like ableism, just overall prejudice in general. There's still prejudice very rampant in the goth community. That's not talked about. When I go to the average goth video on YouTube, for example, they don't touch on things like that. They might talk about things like I'm talking about, like elitism and history and stuff like that. But I still feel like these issues need to be talked about, and not just by people being affected by it, but people who aren't being affected by it. Like, let's talk about the racism part. I still had someone or a couple of people within the past year say that I'm not pale enough to be goth, or I can't be goth. And it's because I'm black. I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? And this is still happening. Some people are just bold enough to still say stuff like that, or they just really think it if they're not saying it. But I have a problem with this, and I don't know if you all are going to see it as a part of elitism, but I consider it as elitism, a form of it. I feel like not talking about social issues with ostracized people in the community is also a form of elitism. I feel like you're avoiding them. You're just like, okay, cool, you can be goth, sure, but I'm not going to acknowledge the struggles you still go through as a goth, and this at the same time, as a goth and a person of color, as a goth and a disabled person, as a goth and an overweight person or underweight person, or someone who's going through something, like stuff like that, like any type of prejudice, and as a goth, and how you're treated just from being different. You're already different being goth, but like, I'm going to touch on the ones that I know about right now, that I personally go through, which is the racism. Even ageism is another thing too, believe it or not. A lot of people don't want to show older goths, but some of them do. And they say, oh, you can still be goth at this age and whatever. There were more things before the elitism that don't really get talked about, I feel like, in a community, like goth parents, which is a little bit more accepted than what it was before. Being a parent in goth, that was a weird thing at first. Like, when I became a parent in goth, I didn't really see too many people talking about that back then, but now I see more YouTube videos about that. But there is something that's bothering me, that I see, like some of the bigger goth YouTubers, they don't, or just people who have a bigger social media presence, they don't really use their platform to talk about real issues that goths face. Because on top of being weird and not fitting in with average society, it also needs to be talked about the other parts that kind of like ostracizes more, like our race and a lot of things regarding prejudice. They don't talk about those things, and I feel it does a disservice to do that, because it's wonderful to talk about makeup and do tutorials and show off your goth collection, but it's just kind of like, okay, cool, but when are you gonna get past the superficial stuff? Like, it's good sometimes, but when are you gonna talk about the real issues? Because it still needs to be talked about. And there are still people out there who are not understanding. They're not understanding the ostracized people in the community. We don't get talked about very much unless you're actually someone going through it. Like, if you're disabled and a black woman of color and goth, it's a different experience than it is with someone who is none of that. And I think that should just be talked about. I feel like that's a form of elitism, because it's excluding a group of people who are a part of your subculture. And that's exactly what they do to people they feel like aren't good enough or posers. And I feel like they're doing the same thing to people like us. I'm going to say us, where they don't talk about that, don't acknowledge that we exist, except if it's to get clout for their page. That bugs me. Like, okay, let me talk about this. This is going to piss off some people too, probably. So getting clout, like saying, oh, black goths exist. And then they post some random pictures of us, and then they have people that share it or whatever. And that gives them a lot of views. And I'm not saying they don't like acknowledge that, but like there are some who do that. And there are some pages that I follow personally who talk about actual social issues. They talk about real issues too. They don't just post the goth memes or just show goth beauty all the time, don't talk about anything. They actually talk about real issues. And those are the ones that I follow. At this point in my life, I've basically distanced myself from the community because of this elitism and talk about real things. And I just can't relate to those people. I can't relate to the goths who do the elitist shit. I can't. And that's a lot of them. And some of them are doing it and they don't realize they're doing it. And some of them are more obvious, like the ones who call everyone a damn poser and say you're not this or that because you don't listen to this or that. I feel like those are the more obvious ones. But the other ones that aren't as obvious are the ones that are excluding the ostracized people in the community. That's what I feel like they're doing. And you're not excluding them like saying, oh, you can't be goth, but you're excluding them by not acknowledging their issues or pretending like their issues don't exist or it's made up in their head. Like cultural appropriation in the community. Boy, that has been something that I've learned a lot about. I didn't really fully understand it or acknowledge it when I first started out, but I know a lot more now. That's not something that's talked about either. And then the moment you try to say that's not cool, they're like, oh, goth is about being whatever you want. You know, you should be able to do whatever you want. True, but not at someone else's expense or their culture or their respect. There's a lot of little things pertaining to this. I'm basically keeping it small right now and just talking about that is in fact a form of elitism. And I don't hear people talk about that one very much. And like I was saying earlier, it's our responsibility to try to work on these issues and talk about it because it's setting an example for the generation of goths after us. And if we want to keep goth going, which it has been for decades, you got to be a bit more open-minded about the fact that not everyone's going to be the same. Things are going to evolve. Nothing stays the same forever. Things evolve. In nature, things evolve. Technology evolves. Life evolves. Everything doesn't stay the same forever. You can evolve and still remember your history. There's nothing wrong with that. So if a baby bat wants to experiment, or even an elder goth could change their mind and want to experiment a little bit and do something different, it's fine. A lot of people just are stuck in their ways. The goth community is no exception. And they want things to stay the same forever. And unfortunately, as mad as you get, things aren't going to stay the same forever. And unfortunately, no matter what you think or how expensive your things are or how many followers you have, no one's better than anybody. And I do find it ironic that with all this elitism and talking about not fitting in, that there are so many people in the goth community who will berate you or insult you for not fitting in. So you get insulted for doing something you're not supposed to be doing in the first place. You're supposed to be different. And if you don't fit in to their idea of what goth is, then you're a poser. So that's crazy to me because you're doing exactly what everyone else has been doing to us, which is ostracizing us, basically. And that's just basically the pot calling the kettle black. You can't get mad at everyone else for treating us that way. And you do the same thing to people into the subculture. I mean, that makes you a massive hypocrite. So I thought that was interesting that that was going on. But when you try to tell them that, they're like the elitists. I'm talking about the elitists. You try to tell them that, they get mad about it. They don't want to hear it. You're like, you got to keep goth pure. You can't do like this or anything like that. That's all I had to say about this. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe for more videos, and let me know if you want me to cover any more topics about the goth community or anything like that. And I will gladly do that in the form of a podcast or a video. Let me know your opinions about goth elitism and your experiences. Thank you for watching, Silkies. Like and subscribe for more videos.